I will take this away and then just give me the hook at 9 o'clock.
I gotcha.
You got me. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here in the morning. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to make this presentation. It's kind of a double hit for you this morning. I'll be taught, the first presentation is on the Distributed Biological Observatory, and the second one will be on the Arctic marine pulses that I'm on a collaborator with Sue Moore. So as far as the presentation here, like I said, it's the Distributed Biological Observatory. It's an international change detection array in the Pacific Arctic. So as part of the presentation, I'm going to have 4 aspects I'd like to cover. One, just briefly on the stressors that we're seeing related to climate and environmental change that can influence biological processes, predator-prey interactions, as well as ecosystem dynamics. So the DBO is based on utilizing repeat sampling on marine transit lines as international ships move from the northern Bering into the Arctic proper. And so it actually facilitates a seasonality, looking at the seasonality of the ecosystem, how it is, and where the trends are. So we know that many observations and systems that are developed have a lot of physical sensors on them, but there is a need for biological sampling in order to look at species composition and changes on a spatial temporal basis and to evaluate ecosystem shifts. So part of this is a coordination of those international ships with some standard measurements. So the auspices of the development of the DBO is under the Pacific Arctic Group. It's a consortium of 6 countries from Russia, China, Japan, Canada, U.S., Korea, and I think I said China already, but they're sampling in the Pacific Arctic regions. So what we are seeing here is quite a bit of, as you know, the reduction of sea ice. It's pretty far north as it is right now, but is recorded in September, and we're seeing warming seawater moving into the system. So some of the key stresses are influencing the ecosystem are the decrease in sea ice extent and the influence that has on the phenology of plankton development and zooplankton development and carbon export. So not only is it the sea ice extent, it's also the duration. We're seeing warming seawater temperatures. This is having an impact on the concentrations of prey and where they're located and when. We also have cases of seasonal acidification, particularly in the deeper, on the shallow shelf systems that have an impact on calcium carbonate and aragonite producing organisms. And then we are seeing indications of species movements northward, both at the prey base as well as some subarctic whales and seals that are moving further north. So the whole purpose of the DBO is to link physics to biology. And what you're seeing on this outline here, we start off with 5 lines, taking advantage that every ship that comes up through Bering Strait is going across this very productive system. And recently we've added those with our Canadian colleagues, 3 sites that we can occupy when the ships are going across them. But the first 5 and the ones here on the outer shelf and slope were designed as areas where we know that there's high productivity, biodiversity, or rates of change. So we're using this as basically a curtain and a gate for looking at as a detection array. As the sea ice pulls back, seawater warms seasonally, and doing this on an annual monitoring basis from as early as May to as late as October, with moorings in place to give a backbone to the observing system. And the strength of this also is on the data management policy that's been agreed on internationally. So just briefly, for those who may not be oriented to the Pacific, we have nutrient-rich Pacific water coming up on the western side of the Bering Strait. This is high nutrients, cold waters, and then the Alaska coastal water, which is nutrient poor, particularly right after the spring bloom, and it's warming waters. So we see a latitudinal increase in bottom water temperatures as the season progresses, and this is what you're seeing, the warm Alaska coastal water near the Alaska and the cold bottom waters that are coming up, particularly in areas that had aplynia in the winter, areas that had ice cover, produced brine, so we get stratification here. And I would just point out as you get up close to the northeast. So what we're doing is we embedded these transect lines in those hotspot areas. And one of the bases for this was 4 decades of the Benthic macrofaunal data, because these organisms live in the sediments. They're not moving around like the epifauna, the fish, or the pelagic. So they're integrating interannually. And so what you're seeing is the persistence in 4 decades of these major hotspots, particularly around Bering Strait, until the 1990s, when we had increased access as the sea ice retreat. We moved into the Chukchi Sea more for sampling. But it's these persistence, particularly north of Bering Strait, that we're tracking as far as part of these ecosystem assessment. And part of the key of this is that we have many indigenous populations that are using a multitude of upper trophics. Not only are they iconic for people to evaluate, but we're seeing shifts of walruses that are losing their platforms to sea ice. Their prey bases, populations of clams are having a change. Diving sea ducks particularly, which is one's here, a threatened species occurring south of St. Lawrence Island that sits in the Polynya, and we've been tracking those for about 30 years. And then these gray whales, which are seasonal migrants that are coming in further into the system, feeding both on amphipods that live in the sediments, but also euphausids in the water column. So they're very much able to take advantage of any of the changing system. So as part of the Pacific Arctic Group activities on an annual basis, this is just an example of 6 of the cruises. Right now, Japan, China, and Korea all have their ships out. We just finished our Canadian-U.S. cruise on the Laurier, and in the past, and hopefully in the future, we'll continue our U.S.-Russian collaboration on vessels, on Russian vessels. But these are just 6 examples of what often are 18 cruises that go through. We have different occupations, and I'll show you some of that data to see the value of working in a concerted international effort. So as part of this development, it was in Ottawa, and actually in 2007, when we sat around within the group and said, what are we collecting across the board that we could build into a biophysical observing system, ship-based? And these are the type of measurements that that were agreed to be done on these standard lines: temperature, salinity, currents, using the ADCP when that is possible, doing standard measurements of chlorophyll and nutrients, abundance biomass. If you're out there in the late spring, ice algae, but most of the work has been starting in May through October, so you're looking at phytoplankton, species composition, zooplankton, and benthos. We also look at the sediment parameters, because you need to know what's going on with the organic carbon and nitrogen content, as well as the grain size, as well as food supply. Seabird and marine mammal surveys. So we try to put as many observers for seabirds and mammals onto these cruises. At the same time, we have moorings and I'll show you a few of those now. They're looking at temperature and salinity, but also fluorescence and nutrients. So that is collecting data throughout the year. And then we also have collaborations on satellite data. So looking at chlorophyll content, temperature, salinity, winds, sea ice concentration, and you can see the rest on that. So some of the examples of the slide that I'll show you now are some of the products that are coming out. We have a website. If you put in DBO Pacific, it'll come up on that. And what we try to do is we have a standard metadata file, and I will show you that briefly because it's the glue that brings together the collections of where these data go. But then what you're seeing here are the trends in the annual sea ice persistence, and particularly up in the northern Chukchi and into the Canada Basin. The red is the hot areas, so this is where the trends are very negative. And you can see vertically here the trends in the annual sea ice persistence, and this is just from 2000, and is green, and the purple is the 1979 when we first started to get satellite records. And what you can point out, this is the DBO 1 and 2 in the northern Bering Sea. We've had actually an increase in sea ice, and part of that has to do with first-year ice that's developing. It's at the end of the extension, so it's not multi-year ice anymore, it's first year. And then as you proceed northward on this latitudinal ray, you can see how, in fact, we're having declines, and it's going out earlier in the season and coming back later in that motion. And as I said, we just started putting in, looking, evaluating. This is from satellite data, looking at the DBO 6, 7, and 8, which are in the Beaufort. So as part of our efforts, we work with NASA, and Joey Camizo and the team are putting together products. This is the sea ice maps here. This is wind surface pressures, and over here on satellite chlorophyll. These are put onto their sites and rotating every 2 weeks, and they are doing statistical evaluations of the differences in trends. And then the data goes into an archive, and you can contact Joey for further information on that. But this is the type of, they have movies that are showing what we're seeing in relation to our DBO areas. So as well, as I mentioned, we want to know what there's on the biological part of so we look at integrated chlorophyll, and you can pick out these areas here that have the really high, the big fat blobs and circles are very high integrated chlorophyll. And we're actually seeing the phenology when we have different cruises of when sea ice production starts, sea ice and then open water production from the south, and you are tracking and then northward as the sea ice retreats. At the same time, we collect samples for phytoplankton IDs, and we're working with our colleagues in Poland to do the identifications on that. And basically, you're seeing this is one of the hot spots right at the international date line between the U.S. and Russia, where we have a lot of organic matter deposited. And these are diatoms, and the blue are dinoflagellates. So as you get closer, the less nutritious, the smaller organisms, as you get closer to the Alaska coastal water. So we're looking at those changes, those populations over the season and then annually. And then this is just one example of nutrients. Anything you see with the bright red are high. So this is this anadir water that is bringing the nutrients that sets the system up for the production. And in Bering Strait, we have that going on throughout the season. Just a few other examples here. What we try to do is these lines are embedded in process studies. So when other cruises, this is the Arctic Marine Biodiversity Observing Network, are doing broad-scale measurements, they're putting in, we're occupying these two lines, DBO 3 and 4, that then puts those lines into the contact. So it basically becomes like the limbs on a tree, and then we are able to start looking at mechanisms and what is happening there. And this is just an example of nutrients, again, the bottom water between the 3, which is the hot spot, which is right down here, and you can still see that anadir water, but it's capped off a little bit deeper here with stratification. Just examples, and we're looking the same type of thing, and you see that the bottom sediments. So why do we care about that? Because that's what maintains the animals. It tells us the quality and the quantity of where that organic matter is going. This is one point here. This rich spot up here is also Hannah Shoal, where we have the walrus, a high concentration of walrus offshore. So moorings are an important part of the observing system, and it is the composite of the international network and sharing of data, because no one country could actually do this alone. So this is an example from Mitoya Ito out of Japan, but these are the authors. They're from 5, 6 countries, and this allowed this seasonality to be evaluated. So what you're seeing here, this is on, you're looking at temperature impacts here, and you're seeing the seasonality as you start moving into the August, and it's really September that you get that warmest pulse. Because it's on the side nearest the Alaska coastline. It's that Alaska coastal water that we're seeing actually a warming, and that has a direct impact on coastal processes. So what we started up in 2016 is to start to inventory the number of moorings. And we have moorings as of this year with Japan putting one in the DBO2 area. We have moorings in the 5 regions of which we have these transect lines. But what you're seeing is there are many others from other programs. So what NOAA has doing through Phyllis Stabenow is putting together the details. So on the Pacific Arctic Group site, there's like, where's the mooring? What are they collecting? Who's the point of contact? So that you can try to, not only that, knowing particularly up here where there's oil and gas development, this is actually smaller than what it used to be, because it'd be acoustic moorings on the bottom. But these come in and out. But we're, as of this year, are pleased to see that we have 5 of them. 2 of them with sediment traps, one in the Chirikov here and one up here that Seth Danielson maintains in his observing system. Just one example of the products coming from, this came out in Shige Nishino's paper in 2015, And you're picking up, what is interesting is a fall bloom. We normally don't see those up in that region, and those are coming out more often now. And in fact, satellite calibrations and processing usually in right about then. So we're working with NASA to try to get those analyses a little further in the fall now, because we're actually seeing this secondary bloom, and then relating that to the results that we're seeing on the time series from the ship. NOAA and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management also collaborate on the aerial surveys of the Arctic marine mammals. So these are overflights. They also can look at those in relation to what we have from the ships. But this is going from DBO actually 3 over to 7. And I would just point out that the gray whales are spending more time here than they used to in the Chirikov, and actually going all the way up to Barrow. And there are some species, humpback whales, and some of the other more subarctic type species that are moving into this system here. And then with the ice retreating back, I would just point out the bowhead whales are actually in the green, which are, you can see them even in offshore areas, but particularly along the coastline that are used both. So this data is also of value for knowing the populations as well as for information on the status for subsistence hunt. So I'd like to just close down on the sharing data protocols we had. We have an international data agreement. This is at this website here. We developed a data policy. We have collaborative teams in the U.S. that we deal with this type of evaluation and submitting of the data. And just briefly, we have a standard metadata file. So no matter where you're submitting your data, whether you keep it in Japan or you put it into NODC for a National Ocean Data Center or you put it in the NSF Arctic Center, everybody in the DBO agrees to fill out these forms. We have 4 of them, one for transects, one for mooring, one for satellites, and one for marine mammal surveys. So just basically where you collected it, what was the name of the station in your core file, what type of parameters, and who's the point of contact. So the idea is that this is then something that can be used as cross-link the program. We also try to have annual data meetings, and this is also an important aspect because we bring together our international partners for 3 days, talk about the data sets we have, where we want to go forward, are there new sites, are there trends, and also that we're planning, currently we have a special issue in the Deep Sea Research 2 that is just being initiated in the fall, and we have about 29, 30 manuscripts that will be going into that. But these data are out ideally for right away for the observing networks, but with some caveats depending with the process cruises and the national limitations. So just to close up, this is the implementation plan, working with Sue Moore, who's the chair of what we have in the U.S. called the NHC Arctic Research Policy Committee, and I'm a co-chair. But basically, just to tie up, we have these spring Pacific Arctic group meetings. We talk about cruise planning. We have the DBO cruises, project sampling. We've just initiated not only showing some of the data here, but really to talk about what are your plans for the following year. And the idea being that we'll have an earlier start to begin talking to issues related to the local community, timing of the subsistence hunt, and to minimize any of the impacts with that. We have the data workshop, we have data projects, and then this becomes an annual cycle of which we follow. So to conclude our future plans, we are working to have expanded to a Pan-Arctica network. We've started that in the Beaufort Sea with the 3 lines that we developed with our Canadian colleagues. We have plans to extend the DBO line into Russian waters westward. That is still an aspiration and was in place, but we have some issues right now with the collaboration. We want to encourage and have been working with the Strategic Initiative Arctic, and IAS, the International Arctic Science Committee, has funded a workshop for a DBO-type Atlantic activity. I'll talk about the marine pulses because this DBO data can fit right into it because it has seasonal parts to it, but that's the next talk. And then we're working also to engage stakeholders because our lines are basically offshore. They start at 3 nautical miles and move off. And we want to have the near shore, some type of community capacity building with some of the programs like OK and Aloka, and working with local communities. So this is a work and part of our goals for the implementation plan. So basically, it evaluates DBO key information. approaches that can be used for management. It can be developed on a Pan-Arctic activity. We are endorsed by the Pacific Arctic Group, but also under IASC for an international monitoring. And then we believe that this is a way to track a biological response for ongoing ecosystem base using multiple studies and for a network of international stakeholders. So with that, I want to thank you, take a few questions, and then we can come back after the other talk too. Thank you.